With her talent and education, Annie rose to a position of prominence in Chicago's fashion industry. She was promoted to Vice President of Styling at Henry Marcus Fashions. This was an unheard of and rare position for a woman in the year 1920. Annie worked hard during the day and in the evenings enjoyed Chicago's social scene. With Prohibition in full force, Annie started frequenting Chicago's speakeasies. She was a regular at the Black Rose Speakeasy on Rush Street. On an early Saturday evening after a full day's work at Henry Marcus Fashions, Annie entered the Black Rose Speakeasy. She knocked on a steel door with a secret knock and gave the password. The steel door opened and Annie entered. All of the tables were filled and people were elbow to elbow at the bar. A combination of cigarette and cigar smoke, along with a faint odor of perfume, filled the air. The trumpet player in a five-piece jazz band was blaring out his solo. Dancers were performing the Varsity Drag, Collegiate, and the Charleston. The president from one of the department stores in Chicago noticed Annie and waved her over to his table. Julius Barber was a well-dressed man in his early 50s with wavy gray hair. He had a distinguished look about himself. "Annie, dear, please sit down," said Julius Barber. "There are no chairs left," said Annie. Julius Barber patted his knee and with a twinkle in his eye said, "Sit here, sweetie." Annie smiled and said, "Now, what would Mrs. Barber say?" With a slight frown, Julius Barber said, "There is no Mrs. Barber. Don't worry, I don't bite. Let me introduce you to all my guests." Everyone at the table looked closely at Annie as she sat on Julius Barber's knee. Annie smiled as she glanced around the table. She did not recognize anyone. Julius introduced Annie as one of Chicago's top fashion designers. When he introduced his guests, he only gave their first names. One of the men, whose name was Carlo, was staring intently at Annie. Carlo was a muscular man with dark, rugged features. He was handsome with blue eyes and coal black hair. Carlo had a serious and almost sinister look. One of the guests left for the evening, and Annie ended up sitting next to Carlo. Carlo smiled at Annie and said, "Did I hear Julius say your name was MacRae?" "Well, yes, he did. Why do you ask?" said Annie. Carlo shook his head slightly and said, "Oh, nothing really, just curious." Carlo said very little about himself, but asked Annie where she was from and about her family. Annie was intrigued by Carlo and his interest in her background. Most men she met seemed to only talk about themselves. Annie found Carlo to be polite and charming. When the evening came to an end, Carlo said, "May I drive you home? I just bought a new Packard, and I'm dying to give someone a ride in it." Annie smiled and said, "I live within walking distance from here." Carlo held Annie's hand and said, "Well, then, let me walk you home." Annie held Carlo's arm as they walked back to her apartment. When they arrived, Carlo said, "It was nice meeting you, Annie. I hope to see more of you." Carlo smiled and then gave Annie a quick kiss on her cheek and quickly walked away. Annie wondered why Carlo left without asking if he could come in for a drink. She would have asked him in if he wouldn't have left so abruptly. Annie had mixed feelings of confusion and disappointment. Carlo walked back to his new Packard coupe. As he drove to Cicero, he thought about the $5,500 he paid for the cream-colored Packard. Carlo said to himself, what the hell, I earned it." It was 12:30 in the morning when Carlo pulled up to a butcher shop in Cicero. He entered the building through a back door and went down into the basement. The basement stank of cigar and cigarette smoke. 7 men were sitting around a table playing cards. Most of them were wearing shoulder holsters with a pistol inside. They looked up at Carlo and one of them said, "Hi, kid." Carlo walked up to one of the players and said, "Uncle Pete, can I have a word with you?" It was no coincidence that Carlo bore a striking resemblance to Pete Roche. Carlo was the son of Pete Roche's brother Paul. Pete Roche joined his brother Paul in Chicago's underworld after he left the cigar factory for the MacRaes. Paul Roche was shot and killed when Carlo was 10 years old. Pete Roche finished his hand and said, "Excuse me, boys, I got to see what my nephew wants." He took a swig of whiskey and walked over to Carlo. They hugged each other, and then Pete Roche said, "Are you in trouble, nephew? Any problems with the last job?" Carlo laughed and said, "Nah, it went smooth as silk, but I've got some information that you'll find very interesting." "Like who'll win the fifth at Hawthorne tomorrow?" said Pete Roche with a big grin. Carlo lit up a cigarette and said, "Much better, Uncle. Do you remember telling me about that cigar factory you used to work at in Milwaukee? Guess who I met tonight? The daughter of the owner, Annie MacRae. I knew her father. He's a good man. So what's the interesting news you have for me?" said Pete Roche. "This broad was a real talker, and I found out that her twin brother runs a cigar business. It gets better. You know, the boys are always looking for better ways to distribute our stuff. Well, they have a whole fleet of trucks that deliver cigars all over the Midwest. I see some great possibilities," said Carlo Roche. Pete Roche stroked his chin and said, "That is interesting news. Did you get into her pants?" Carlo blew a puff of smoke and said, "Not yet. I'm playing it cool with this one, but I could feel she really wanted to." Pete Roche put his hand on Carlo's shoulder and said, "I'll set up a meeting with the Don. Now I got to get back to that game. I'm on a winning streak." 2 days later, a meeting was held in the basement of the butcher shop. All of the men from the other night's card game were present. There was a table set up with various cheeses, fruits, sausages, and prosciutto, along with cannolis and pastries. Several carafes of coffee were available. No wine or liquor was present. Don Giuseppe Armedo did not believe in drinking at meetings. He was a short and stout man in his late 60s, with a full head of white hair and a soft-spoken voice. Although the Don's appearance was not imposing, he ruled his section of Chicago with a dichotomy of kindness and ruthlessness. The Don stood up and said, "Thank you for all coming here today. Help yourselves to the food. After our meeting, we can all have some good wine from Sicily. So, Pete, what is the important news from your nephew?" Pete said, "Let Carlo tell you." The Don motioned to Carlo. Carlo stood and said, "I met a gal the other night at the Black Rose. She liked me and told me her whole family history. She is the daughter of a guy who owns a cigar factory in Milwaukee. The guy is a big shot in South Dakota, and his son runs the business. The place does very well, and they have a fleet of trucks that deliver cigars all over the Midwest. I think we could coax them into delivering some of our liquor with their cigars. We could hit some of the areas where we've had problems with the law." The Don said, "And how would we do that?" Carlo replied with enthusiasm, "We could put false bottoms in the floors of the trucks. They deliver cigars to people who I know would buy our stuff. The cigar business has a good reputation, and no one would ever suspect anything." The Don said, "And how could we convince them to do this?" Carlo said, "I think we can get to them through the broad. She's got the hots for me." The Don said, "Have you slept with her yet?" "Not yet, but I will," said Carlo, smiling. The Don said in a cool voice, "And what if we cannot convince them?" Carlo looked around the room. He laughed and said, "The boys and I have ways of convincing anyone to do anything." Carlo patted the pearl-handled 1911 Colt in his shoulder holster. Pete Roche stood up. He looked at Carlo, then at the Don, and said in a loud voice, "Now wait a minute. I don't want anything to happen to the MacRae family. John MacRae was always fair to me. It was my fault that I was careless and got caught." The Don gave Pete Roche an angry look and said, "Pete, that's not yours to decide." He looked at Carlo and said, "See what you can do with the young lady and then report back to me." Our business is finished for now. Let's have some of that good wine from Sicily. Pete Roche frowned and sat down, muttering to himself. John MacRae returned from a town council meeting in the late afternoon. He kissed Molly on the cheek and said, "What's for supper, dear?" "Oh, why don't we go out, Johnny? I'm just not in the mood to cook tonight," said Molly, as she gave John MacRae a slight hug. John MacRae brushed Molly's black hair back and said, "Fine with me. Let's go to the Franklin Hotel. They've got the best steaks in town." Molly frowned and said, "In town?" "Well, almost as good as that old Duchess made for me," said John MacRae, grinning. "Old Duchess, huh? And you're still a spring chicken?" said Molly. After they finished dining at the Franklin Hotel, John MacRae ordered a brandy. He lit up a cigar and pulled a telegram from his vest pocket and said, "I received a strange telegram. From all people, Pete Roche. He said he wanted to meet with me when I go to Milwaukee next month. He said it was about Annie and it was urgent. I wonder how he knows about Annie and that we're going to Chicago next month. Are you going to meet him?" said Molly. John MacRae blew a puff of smoke and said, "Well, yes, I suppose I should, especially if it involves our Annie." In a concerned tone, Molly said, "Well, you better be careful. I seem to remember that Vincent mentioned that Pete carries a gun." 1 week later, the Don asked to see Carlo in private. Carlo walked into the Don's parlor. He took the Don's hand and kissed it. The Don motioned for Carlo to sit down. Carlo said, "What can I do for you, Don Romero?" The Don spoke quietly but with authority and said, "Carlo, we have a serious problem. It involves your uncle. Here, read this telegram." Carlo read the telegram. It was addressed to John MacRae. He could feel his face becoming flushed. Carlo regained his composure and said, "Don Romero, I think there's nothing to this." The Don said loudly, "Nothing? Not only did your uncle send this telegram, but he has been telling people that he does not agree with my decision to invest this cigar business thing." "Do you want me to talk some sense into my uncle?" said Carlo in a nervous tone. The Don said quietly, "No, he must be taken care of. This is an act of betrayal. There's no telling what else he might do. I want you to do this work for us." "Can't you give him a pass?" said Carlo. The Don slammed his hand on the table and said, "No, he's been warned before about things like this." "Why me? Can't one of the other boys do this?" said Carlo. "You must prove your loyalty. I cannot take any chances because of your involvement with that young lady. Women can do strange things to a man." "I want this done right away," said Don Armedo. "Yes, my Don. What do you want done with the body?" said Carlo. "Leave him lay wherever he falls. I want people to see what happens when they go against our rules," said the Don with a faint smile. "Consider it done," said Carlo. He stood up and was about to kiss the Don's hand when the Don stood up. He gave Carlo a firm hug and kiss on the cheek. As Carlo drove the Packard down Lake Drive, he began to ponder how he would kill Pete Roche. Carlo loved his uncle, but he must not go against the Don's orders. He began to feel that Annie was somewhat responsible for his uncle's impending death. Carlo started to develop an intense hatred for Annie. "I'll take care of her someday," thought Carlo. When he arrived back at his apartment, he selected a snub-nosed revolver from his collection and loaded it with 38 special cartridges. 2 days later, Carlo met Pete Roche at Nico's restaurant in Cicero for an early dinner. Carlo knew that his uncle would not suspect anything amiss, as he and Carlo often dined there. Halfway through their meals of lasagna and veal marsala, Pete Roche started to talk about Don Armedo. He expressed his displeasure with the Don's decision to persuade the MacRae cigar factory to help them with their liquor deliveries. Pete Roche went on to say that he was going to meet with John MacRae. At that moment, Carlo knew there could be no mercy for Pete Roche. "How's your veal, Uncle?" said Carlo. Pete Roche smiled and said, "Excellent as usual. Say, how about stopping for a drink afterwards?" Carlo took a sip of wine and said, "I've got a better idea. You always mention that you need practice with your pistol. It's still light out. How about if we stop off in the woods behind the old ballpark? We could bring some empty bottles with us to shoot at." "Well, I'm not packing anything right now," said Pete Roche. "That's okay. You can shoot mine. I've got some extra ammo in the car. You really ought to try a 45 instead of that puny 38 you usually carry," said Carlo as he patted the pearl-handled 1911 pistol in his shoulder holster. Pete Roche wiped red sauce from his cheek and said, "Sounds good. I've always wanted to shoot that cannon you carry." Carlo drove the Packard to a secluded wooded area behind an old abandoned ballpark. Carlo and Pete Roche walked into a wooded area. Carlo set up 5 empty wine bottles on an old wooden crate. He walked back and handed his pearl-handled 1911 pistol to his uncle and said, "It's loaded. All you need to do is release the safety. I carry it cocked and locked, so it's loaded and ready if I need it in a hurry. There's a round in the chamber and 7 rounds in the magazine. Just aim and pull the trigger. When it's empty, I'll show you what to do." Pete Roche missed several times, then finally hit 4 of the bottles. After the 1911 pistol was empty, he smiled and said, "Now what do I do, nephew?" Carlo said, "Let me set up some more bottles for you." He walked over to the crate and set up more bottles, and then walked back to Pete Roche. He took the pistol and said, "First you drop the magazine and then put a new one in. Then you rack the slide like this and you're ready to shoot again. Squeeze the trigger, don't jerk it." Carlo handed the pistol back to Pete Roche. Pete Roche smiled and said, "Not bad. Maybe I'll get one of these." He started firing again at the bottles. Carlo stood behind Pete Roche and pulled a snub-nosed revolver from his pocket. He held the pistol a few inches away from the back of Pete Roche's head. As Pete Roche hit the 3rd bottle, Carlo pulled the trigger. A .38 special bullet crashed into his uncle's brain. Pete Roche was no more. Carlo picked up all of the spent .45 brass and counted it. He removed the magazine from his 1911 pistol and put 4 rounds back into the magazine. Carlo put 1 round in the chamber, racked the slide, put the safety on, and then put it back into his shoulder holster. He dragged Pete Roche's lifeless body out of the wooded area where it would be noticed. Carlo did not like using telephones, but he was not in the mood to see the Don in person, so he called Don Ormetto up and said, "The package has been delivered." 1 week later, John MacRae and Molly had just finished eating supper. John MacRae took a sip of coffee, then lit a cigar. He turned to Molly and said, "Well, I guess I won't be meeting Pete." "Well, why not?" said Molly. John MacRae blew a puff of smoke and said, "Vincent sent me a wire and said that Pete was found with a bullet in the back of his head." Molly looked puzzled and said, "How did Vincent know?" John MacRae smiled slightly and said, "Vincent has become quite the businessman. To keep abreast of things, he reads several newspapers each day. He noticed an article in the Chicago Tribune about Pete. They have no idea who did it." Molly said, "Are we still going to Milwaukee next week?" "Of course," said John MacRae. Annie was examining a bolt of silk from Japan with one of Henry Marcus Fashion's dressmakers. Molly said to the dressmaker, "This silk from Japan is better than what we buy from China, and it's less money. Use this for the evening gowns in our next show." The dressmaker nodded. As she was about to speak, Annie's secretary interrupted her and said, "Miss MacRae, there is someone here to see you." Annie frowned and said, "Who is it? I don't recall having any appointments today." The secretary smiled and said, "He said his name was Carlo and he said that you knew him. He's a very handsome young man. He looks like a buyer from New York." "He's not a buyer. Have him wait in my office. Tell him I'll be there in a few minutes," said Annie. She finished giving instructions to the dressmaker and then looked in the mirror and combed her hair. Annie walked back to her office. Carlo was looking out a window and admiring the view. He turned to Annie and said, "That's quite a view you have here." "Yes, it is. Please sit down." "How did you find me?" said Annie. Carlo sat down. He smiled and said, "I got your name from Julius. I would have called you, but I hate telephones." "So what brings you to Henry Marcus?" said Annie. "You're certainly not a buyer," as she studied Carlo. "Okay if I smoke? I wanted to ask you out for dinner," said Carlo. Carlo pulled out a Camel cigarette from a gold case and lit it. He blew a small puff and said, "Are you free tonight? We could go to the Drake Hotel. They serve a pretty good steak and their seafood is excellent. What do you say?" Annie tried not to sound too anxious and said, "Yes, I'm free and I love seafood. I've had my fill of steak in South Dakota." Carlos stood up and said, "Good. I'll pick you up at 7. He gave Annie a quick smile and left. Annie was again puzzled by Carlo's rather quick exit. She wondered if she should ask him in for a drink when the evening was over. Carlo was prompt and picked up Annie exactly at 7. There was not much conversation on the drive over to the Drake Hotel. When they arrived, the maitre d' winked at Carlo and gave them a booth in a secluded area of the restaurant. Without looking at the menu, Carlo ordered a porterhouse steak medium rare. Annie studied the menu and ordered the planked whitefish. Carlo ordered a bottle of Chianti. Carlo's change in demeanor surprised Annie. He was very talkative that evening as compared to the first time when they met. He talked about his childhood in Chicago and told Annie he worked as a claims adjuster for a small insurance company. "I love this wine. So, Carlo, how do you know Julius?" said Annie as she took a sip of the Chianti. Carlo lit a cigarette and said, "I did some private work for Julius. One of his employees tried to sue him, and I discovered the fraud he was pulling." "What happened?" said Annie with an interested look. Carlo smiled and said, "Oh, he dropped the lawsuit after I talked with him." Carlo did not mention that he murdered the employee and the body was never found. "You must be a very persuasive person." "I can be when it's necessary. Did you enjoy your dinner?" said Carlo as he asked for the check. They drove back to Annie's apartment. Carlo walked Annie to the door and said, "Are you going to ask me in for a drink?" Annie blushed slightly and said, "Yes, but Carlo, I don't even know your last name." Carlo was prepared for this question and said, "It's Marco, Carlo Marco." Annie smiled and said, "That has a nice ring to it." They entered Annie's apartment. Annie poured Carlo a glass of scotch, and she had a glass of sherry. They sat together on a large red velvet couch. Carlo took a sip of the scotch and said, "This is pretty good stuff. How did you get it? It's illegal, you know." Annie smiled and said, "That's one of the perks of being a vice president at Henry Marcus Fashions." After Annie and Carlo had several drinks, Carlo edged closer to Annie. He put his arms around her and kissed her gently on her hand, then on her lips. Annie returned Carlo's kiss with vigor. They kissed for a while, and then Carlo picked up Annie and carried her into Annie's bedroom. They made love passionately and then fell asleep in each other's arms. When Annie awoke at 5 a.m, Carlo was already gone. Annie enjoyed making love to Carlo, but something held her back from falling head over heels in love with him. He was handsome, charming, and polite, but there was something different and almost sinister about Carlo. Annie compared Carlo to the men she had affairs with. Carlo was almost too good to be true. She wanted to see him again, but she would be on her guard. In the next week, Annie and Carlo had dinner 2 more times. Each time they ended up the evening at Annie's and made love. Each time Carlo left early in the morning before sunrise. Annie was beginning to feel comfortable with Carlo. One afternoon, Carlo stopped by Annie's office. He asked Annie if she would like to go with him next week to a friend's lake cottage in northern Wisconsin. Carlo knew what Annie's answer would be, and he had his reply prepared. Annie smiled and said, "I'd like to, but I'm meeting my parents in Milwaukee next week." Without hesitation, Carlo said, "I would love to go with you and meet your father, especially after all you told me about him. I've only been to Milwaukee a few times." "Oh, you could go with me, but we couldn't stay in the same room at night. My father is rather old-fashioned," said Annie. In reality, Carlo had stayed many times in Milwaukee after completing jobs for Don Carlo. Carlo thought to himself, "Our plan is working perfectly." After Carlo told Don Armedo of his first meeting with Annie, the Don had the railroad and telegraph offices in Milwaukee and Chicago monitored. He was aware of anything that involved John MacRae and Pete Roche. The Don told Carlo that this would be a perfect time to visit Milwaukee and check out the MacRae cigar factory. Carlo now knew how the Don found out about Pete Roche's warning to John MacRae. The Don didn't miss a trick.